At our 40th wedding anniversary, the room went completely silent. My wife took the microphone, looked out at the crowd of our closest friends, and smiled. She said she wanted to dedicate the next dance to the man she had loved for so long. Everyone turned to look at me. I even took a step forward, my heart swelling with pride. But she walked right past me. She did not even brush my shoulder. Instead, she walked over to my brother, took his hand, and led him to the center of the dance floor. The room erupted in applause, thinking it was a sweet family gesture. But later that night, one simple question about a medical allergy would reveal a truth so sickening it would cause my wife to choke on her wine and my brother to collapse on the floor in a panic. If you are just starting to watch this story, now take a deep breath. Because what I am about to tell you is something I never imagined would happen in my own family, under my own roof. If you have ever been betrayed by the people you sacrificed everything for, please hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss my next life stories. And tell me in the comments where you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. It makes me really happy to know which corner of the country or the world is listening to me. The story begins at the Denver Country Club. The chandeliers were glowing, the champagne was flowing, and the jazz band was playing a soft, elegant melody. I am Richard. I am 70 years old, and for 4 decades I believed I had built a solid foundation for my family. But as a man who has worked with blueprints his whole life, I should have known that foundations can hide deep structural flaws. I stood near the edge of the dance floor with a crystal glass in my hand, wearing a custom tuxedo, feeling like the luckiest man in Colorado. Patty, my wife of 40 years, looked stunning in her silver evening gown. When she took the microphone, her voice echoed through the grand ballroom, dedicating the dance to her true love. I smiled. I adjusted my bow tie and stepped forward. I was ready to take my wife in my arms and celebrate the beautiful life we had built together. But Patty did not look at me. Her eyes were fixed on a table near the back of the room. She walked right past me. The breeze of her dress fluttered against my legs as she moved. I stood frozen, the smile dying on my face. She walked directly up to my younger brother, Tommy. Tommy is 68, but he has always acted like he is 25. He stood up, flashing that arrogant, careless grin he has had since we were kids. Patty took his hand. They walked to the center of the room, completely ignoring my existence. The band started playing a slow, romantic jazz tune. They pulled each other close, much too close. The crowd clapped, assuming it was just a touching moment between a sister-in-law and her beloved brother-in-law. But as I watched Patty rest her head against Tommy's shoulder, my stomach twisted into a tight, cold knot. I took a sip of my champagne, but it tasted like ash in my mouth. I looked at the two of them swaying under the warm lights, and all I could think about was the heavy price I had paid for their comfort. I am a structural engineer. For 30 years I spent my winters freezing on high-rise scaffolds in the brutal Denver cold. I breathed in steel dust and concrete powder. I ruined my knees climbing icy ladders in sub-zero temperatures. I worked 80-hour weeks calculating load-bearing weights and stress points so my family could live in absolute luxury. And a massive chunk of the money I bled for went straight to Tommy. Tommy was the golden boy who could never do anything right. While I was out on construction sites, shivering in the wind, Tommy was wearing fancy suits, playing the role of a hotshot real estate developer. But his projects always failed. I bailed him out of 3 separate bankruptcies over the years. I remember sitting in cold, fluorescent-lit lawyers' offices writing checks that wiped out my personal savings just to keep Tommy out of federal prison. I even set up a $2 million trust fund for him 5 years ago, simply because he sat at my dinner table crying to Patty about how he was aging, broke and terrified of the future. Patty had begged me to help him. She told me family was everything. I sacrificed my own health, missing my daughter's school plays and working grueling weekends just to make sure my brother never had to struggle. And here he was, holding my wife on our anniversary, spinning her around the floor while I stood by the buffet tables like a forgotten guest. The sheer disrespect was a physical blow. I watched her hand resting on the back of his neck, her fingers lightly tracing his collar. That was a gesture she used to do with me decades ago when we were young and deeply in love. The crowd continued to clap, completely blind to the agonizing tension radiating from the center of the room. By midnight, the party was finally winding down. The guests were saying their goodbyes, leaving empty glasses and half-eaten cake on the tables. The jazz band was packing up their instruments. I felt a heavy, exhausting ache in my bones, a kind of fatigue that had nothing to do with my age. I just wanted to go home. I walked toward the coat room to grab our jackets and Patty's silk shawl. The corridor leading to the coat room was dimly lit and completely quiet. As I approached the heavy wooden door, which was left slightly open, I heard a low, hushed voice. It was Tommy. I stopped in my tracks, my expensive leather shoes silent on the thick carpet. I held my breath and peered through the narrow crack in the door. I saw them. Patty was standing incredibly close to Tommy, ostensibly helping him put on his cashmere overcoat. But her hands did not move away. They lingered on his chest, smoothing the fabric with a slow, deliberate tenderness. Then she reached down and squeezed his hand. It was not a casual, friendly squeeze. It was the tight, desperate grip of two people sharing a massive, hidden secret. Tommy leaned in his lips, brushing against her hair, and whispered something I could not quite hear. Patty closed her eyes and let out a soft, trembling sigh. The air in my lungs turned to ice. My heart hammered against my ribs, echoing in my ears like a warning bell. I carefully stepped back into the shadows of the hallway before they could see me. The heavy, awkward silence of the empty corridor felt like a concrete wall pressing down on my chest. I am an engineer. I know how to spot a crack in a foundation, and I was staring at a massive structural failure in my own life. I knew right then and there that something was horribly wrong. But I had no idea just how dark and twisted the truth actually was. The real nightmare was waiting for us back at the house. The drive back to our mansion was suffocating. I sat in the passenger seat staring out the window while Patty drove. Tommy sat in the back humming a tune as if he did not have a care in the world. The silence between Patty and me was thick with tension. I kept my hands folded, trying to calculate how my life had lost its structural integrity. When we pulled up to the sweeping driveway of our home, I felt a strange detachment. This house paid for with my sweat, and health felt like a beautifully decorated prison. Waiting in the grand living room was my daughter Valerie, a brilliant 35-year-old pediatric surgeon. She had left the anniversary party earlier because of a morning shift, but she was still awake, sitting by the fireplace with herbal tea. Seeing her brought a brief moment of warmth to my chest. I had worked hard to put her through medical school, and I was proud of her. She looked up and smiled as we walked in, unaware of the poison seeping into our family dynamic. Patty immediately put on her usual mask of perfection. She sighed, kicked off her heels, and walked to the wet bar to pour herself a glass of red wine. Tommy dropped onto a leather sofa, asking for a glass of bourbon. I stood by the edge of the rug, watching them. The image of Patty squeezing Tommy's hand in the dark corridor burned into my brain. I needed to know if my suspicions were just paranoid delusions or if there was a tangible connection between them. As an engineer, I rely on facts that cannot be manipulated by lies. I looked at Valerie, and suddenly a piece of medical history flashed through my mind. It was a detail so specific, so fundamentally biological, that it could not be faked. I walked slowly toward the center of the room. I kept my tone perfectly casual. I looked directly at my daughter and spoke. Valerie, I have been thinking about something lately, and with your medical expertise, maybe you can help me understand it. You know how you are deathly allergic to penicillin? How you carry that severe anaphylactic trait? Valerie nodded, taking a sip of her tea. She looked confused but answered easily. Yes, Dad. It is a severe hypersensitivity. I carry an auto-injector everywhere. Why do you ask? I kept my eyes on Valerie, but my peripheral vision was locked on Patty and Tommy. I let a few seconds of silence stretch out. Well, I was reading an article about genetic inheritance, and it struck me as odd. Neither Patty nor I carry the trait for a penicillin allergy. We have both been treated with it dozens of times with no reaction. It is highly unusual for a child to develop such a severe genetic allergy when neither parent possesses the gene. But then I remembered something from when we were kids. Do you remember, Tommy? When you were 20 years old, you took a penicillin tablet for a throat infection and went into severe anaphylactic shock. You almost died in the emergency room. The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. I did not make an accusation. I just laid out the biological facts and waited to see how the structure would react to the stress test. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Patty had just taken a large sip of her red wine. The moment the words left my mouth, she choked violently. The wine sprayed from her lips as she gasped for air. Her fingers lost all their strength, and the crystal glass slipped from her hand. It hit the floor with a sharp crash, shattering into dozens of pieces and sending red wine splashing across the baseboards. She doubled over, coughing uncontrollably, her face turning a frantic shade of red. Her eyes were wide with a terror that had nothing to do with choking. But Tommy's reaction was even worse. He had been raising his glass to his mouth, but he froze completely. All the color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin sickly gray. His jaw dropped. He looked at me, then at Patty, and then a profound panic washed over him. Instead of answering my question, he dropped his glass onto the rug. He let out a loud gasp and grabbed his chest with both hands. His face contorted into a mask of agony, and he slumped forward, sliding off the sofa and collapsing onto the floor. Valerie instantly dropped her teacup and sprang into action. Years of medical training kicked in immediately. She rushed to Tommy's side, falling to her knees and shouting his name. She pressed her fingers hard against his neck to check his pulse, screaming at her mother to call for an ambulance right now. The room was total chaos. Valerie was shouting commands. Tommy was groaning on the floor, clutching his shirt, and Patty was leaning against the bar, trembling violently as she fumbled for her cell phone. But I did not move. I did not rush to my brother's side. I did not comfort my daughter. I just stood there perfectly still, looking at the broken glass and the spilled wine on the floor. Then I slowly raised my eyes and locked them onto Patty. She looked back at me over her phone screen. Her chest was heaving, and her hands were shaking so badly she could barely dial the numbers. She looked absolutely, completely terrified. Valerie kept screaming that Tommy was having a massive heart attack. But as I stared into my wife's horrified eyes, I knew the truth. My brother was not having a heart attack. He was a coward backed into a corner, and his collapse was a desperate response to panic. The crack in the foundation had just split wide open, and I was finally ready to watch the entire corrupt structure come crashing down around them. The ambulance arrived in less than 10 minutes. The paramedics burst through our front door with a stretcher, their radios crackling in the tense silence of our living room. Valerie was rapidly firing off medical terminology, barking vital signs and possible cardiac protocols while they loaded my brother onto the gurney. Patty was a sobbing mess. She grabbed her designer coat and scrambled into the back of the ambulance, leaving me to follow in my car. The drive to the hospital was a blur of flashing red lights reflecting off the dark Colorado roads. I kept my hands firmly gripped on the steering wheel. My mind was unusually calm. It was the kind of cold, calculating calm I always felt when a massive steel beam was hoisted into the air on a construction site. One wrong move and everything would collapse. I needed to let the dust settle before I made my next calculation. The sterile, blinding white lights of the emergency room waiting area felt like an interrogation room. I sat on a rigid plastic chair staring at the scuffed linoleum floor. The smell of strong antiseptic and stale coffee lingered in the air. About an hour later, the heavy double doors swung open. Patty walked out. Her silver evening gown was now wrinkled, and her makeup was smeared underneath her eyes. She marched straight toward me. She did not look like a woman relieved that her brother-in-law was alive. She looked like a trapped animal ready to bite. She threw her purse onto the empty chair next to me and buried her face in her hands, letting out a loud, dramatic sob. Then the performance began. She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with fresh tears, and her voice trembled with perfectly manufactured outrage. She pointed a shaking finger at my chest. "How could you do this to us, Richard? How could you ruin our 40th anniversary with such a cruel, insane question?" She cried out, making sure the few other people in the waiting room could hear her. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping into a vicious hiss. "Genetics skip generations all the time. My grandfather had a severe penicillin allergy, and it simply skipped me and went straight to Valerie. It is basic biology. But you could not just ask privately, could you? You had to corner Tommy. You know how much stress he has been under. You know he has a weak heart. You gave him a massive panic-induced heart attack, Richard. If he dies in there, his blood is entirely on your hands." I sat perfectly still and let her pour her venom over me. I nodded slowly, putting on the mask of a bewildered, deeply apologetic husband. I reached out and gently patted her hand, whispering that I was sorry, that I was just curious, and did not mean any harm. I played the fool. But inside, my engineer's brain was meticulously analyzing the structural flaw in her lie. She had claimed her grandfather had the allergy, but I knew for a fact that her grandfather died of an infection in the 1940s, precisely because he refused to stop taking penicillin. It was a lie, a sloppy, desperate lie built on a crumbling foundation. As I looked at her weeping face, a sickening memory bubbled up to the surface. 5 years ago, we had been sitting at our mahogany dining table. Tommy had come over looking disheveled and smelling of cheap whiskey. He cried, genuinely sobbing about how his latest real estate venture had gone bankrupt. He said he had nothing left for retirement, that he was going to end up homeless. Patty had held his hand and wept right along with him. She begged me to help him. She told me we had more than enough, that family takes care of family. Out of a deep sense of brotherly guilt, I had my lawyers draft a $2 million irrevocable trust fund for Tommy. I handed over $2 million of my hard-earned money, the money I had sacrificed my youth to earn just to secure his future. Now, looking at Patty fiercely defending him, I realized that the trust fund was not an act of charity. It was a severance package they had extracted from me together. They had played me for an absolute fool. I told Patty I needed a moment to clear my head. I stood up and walked down the long, quiet hallway toward the hospital cafeteria to get us some coffee. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly above my head as I walked, adding a strange hum to the tense and quiet atmosphere. My footsteps echoed softly against the walls. As I approached the vending machines, I saw the emergency room attending physician walk out of the swinging doors. He was a tall man with tired eyes holding a clipboard. Valerie had introduced him to us earlier. I quickly changed my direction and intercepted him near the nurse's station. I put on my best worried brother expression and asked for a private update. The doctor looked around, then lowered his voice, speaking with the casual tone of a professional who had seen this 1,000 times. "Mr. Stanton, I wanted to tell your daughter, but she is currently filling out the admission paperwork. Your brother's heart is perfectly fine." I stared at him, letting the words sink in. The doctor gave a dismissive little sigh and tapped his pen against the clipboard. "I am honestly not sure why your wife was screaming about a heart attack. We ran a full electrocardiogram and checked his blood work twice. There are absolutely no cardiac enzymes present in his system. His coronary arteries are completely clear. What he experienced was not a myocardial infarction. It was just a severe anxiety attack. He panicked, plain and simple. We are giving him a mild sedative right now, but structurally, the man is perfectly and completely fine." I thanked the doctor, keeping my expression entirely neutral, and walked away. I did not go back to the waiting room to check on my wife. I did not want to look at her tears or listen to another manufactured sob story. I walked straight out of the hospital, sliding doors, and into the freezing Colorado night. The cold air hit my face sharp and biting, but it felt incredibly grounding. I got into my car and drove back to the mansion alone. The streets were deserted. My mind was racing, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal taking shape. If Tommy was not having a heart attack, his collapse was a calculated distraction. A smokescreen designed to pull focus away from my question about the allergy. And if it was a distraction, then what exactly were they trying to hide in the chaos of those 15 minutes before the ambulance arrived? When I pulled into my driveway, the massive house looked entirely different to me. It no longer looked like a home. It looked like a crime scene. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was dead silent. Valerie had evidently gone to bed, likely exhausted from the emotional toll of the evening. I walked through the main living area. The broken shards of the shattered wine glass were still scattered across the expensive Persian rug. The dark red stain had soaked deep into the fibers, looking exactly like dried blood in the dim moonlight filtering through the windows. I stepped around the mess and made my way down the long hallway toward my private home office. This room was my sanctuary. It was where I reviewed architectural blueprints, managed my engineering firm, and handled all of our family finances. Behind my heavy oak desk was a locked server cabinet that housed the hard drives for our internal security system. Years ago, after a string of burglaries in our wealthy neighborhood, I had installed high-definition cameras in every common area of the house, including the hallways and the office. Patty knew they were there, but over the decades, she had simply forgotten about them. I sat down in my leather chair, booted up the surveillance monitor, and typed in my administrative password. The screen flickered to life, displaying a grid of 6 different camera feeds. I dragged the timeline back to the exact moment my wine glass shattered. I watched the scene unfold again, from a cold, detached, elevated view. I saw myself standing in the center of the room, rigid and calm. I saw Tommy clutching his chest and dropping to the floor. I watched my daughter rush to his side, her face a mask of absolute terror, performing chest compressions on a man whose heart was beating perfectly normally. Then I focused entirely on Patty. While Valerie was screaming for an ambulance, Patty had backed away toward the wet bar. She had pulled out her phone, pretending her hands were shaking too badly to dial the numbers. But the camera angle from the ceiling showed something I had missed in the chaos. She was not dialing emergency services. She was watching me. The moment I turned my back to look down at Valerie and Tommy, Patty slipped her phone into her pocket. She did not run to the coat closet to grab his medical insurance cards. She did not run to the kitchen for water. Instead, she spun around and sprinted silently down the hallway. I switched the primary feed to the hallway camera. Patty was moving very fast, looking over her shoulder to make sure no one had followed her. She reached the door to my home office, pushed it open, and slipped inside. I quickly toggled to the office camera. The room was dark, but the infrared lens captured her movements with perfect clarity. Patty practically dove into my leather chair. She grabbed my computer mouse and jiggled it to wake up the screen. I watched as she reached into the neckline of her silver evening gown and pulled out a small metallic object. It was a USB flash drive. She plugged it directly into the tower of my private desktop. She navigated through my file directories with terrifying speed and precision. This was not a panicked wife looking for emergency contacts. This was a woman executing a rehearsed, premeditated data breach. She clicked a few times, waited agonizingly for a progress bar to finish filling up, and then yanked the flash drive out of the machine. She shoved the drive deep into her bra, smoothed down her dress, and ran back out to the living room, just as the ambulance sirens began wailing in the distance. My hands felt entirely numb as I reached forward and turned on my desktop tower. The screen brightened, casting a pale glow over my face. I did not need to guess what she had taken, but I needed absolute proof. I opened my system administration tools and pulled up the recent file access logs. I scrolled down to the exact timestamp of the ambulance arrival. I stared at the screen, my breathing shallow and tight. She had not gone into my personal folders. She had not stolen family photos, tax returns, or our daily banking passwords. She had completely bypassed the decoy folders on my desktop and drilled straight down into a hidden encrypted directory that I thought only I knew how to access. The log showed a single file had been copied to an external drive. It was a master spreadsheet titled with a simple alphanumeric code. That single file contained the master routing numbers, authorization codes, and offshore transfer protocols for my entire commercial real estate retirement fund. It was a massive account holding exactly $15 million in secure liquid assets. This was the money I had bled for over 30 grueling years. My wife was not just cheating on me behind my back. She was actively robbing me blind. I sat in my leather chair until the first pale light of morning crept through the office blinds. I did not sleep. I could not sleep. My mind was running through 1,000 different scenarios, calculating load distributions and failure points. $15 million. It was not just money. It was the physical manifestation of my life's work. Every missed dinner, every weekend spent freezing on a construction site, every ounce of stress that had aged me before my time was encapsulated in that fund. And my wife had just handed the keys to my brother. I heard the front door open around 7 o'clock. Patty had returned from the hospital, and she had brought Tommy with her. I quickly shut down the desktop tower, smoothed my shirt, and walked out to the living room to greet them. Tommy looked perfectly fine, though he was putting on a pathetic show of walking slowly and clutching his chest. Patty was hovering around him like a worried mother, holding his elbow and guiding him toward the guest bedroom. I intercepted them near the hallway, putting on the mask of a deeply apologetic and concerned husband. I asked Tommy how he was feeling, keeping my voice gentle and completely devoid of suspicion. He gave a weak, dramatic sigh and muttered that the doctors told him he needed absolute rest. Patty glared at me, her eyes daring me to cause another scene. I did not. Instead, I rubbed the back of my neck and let out a heavy, exhausted sigh of my own. I looked at Patty and told her I had terrible news. I received an emergency phone call from the firm early this morning. I lied, my tone perfectly steady. The foundation on our new commercial high-rise project in Seattle is showing massive hairline fractures. The whole structure is at risk of shifting. They need me on site immediately to assess the damage and rewrite the load calculations. I have to leave for 2 weeks, maybe more. I watched Patty closely. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. The tight, angry lines around her mouth vanished, replaced by a sudden, unmistakable flash of profound relief. She quickly covered it up by reaching out and squeezing my arm, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Oh, Richard, that is awful. But you have to go. Your company needs you. Do not worry about us. I will stay right here and take care of Tommy. We will be perfectly fine. Just focus on your work." She practically pushed me toward the master bedroom to pack my suitcase, eager to get me out of her way. I threw a few changes of clothes into my dark leather travel bag, but my mind was focused entirely on my next strategic move. I needed hard, irrefutable evidence. I needed science. Biology does not lie, and numbers do not lie. If I was going to tear this massive building down, I needed to know exactly what kind of toxic materials I was dealing with. While Patty was in the kitchen making tea for her supposedly ailing brother, I quietly slipped into the guest bathroom. Tommy's travel toiletry bag was sitting on the counter. I opened it and pulled out his hairbrush. Woven into the bristles were several strands of his gray hair, complete with the follicles. I carefully extracted them and placed them into a small plastic Ziploc bag I had brought from my office desk. Then I walked silently down the hall to Valerie's old childhood bedroom. She did not live here anymore, but she still kept some of her things in the vanity drawer for when she stayed over. I opened the drawer and found one of her fabric hair ties. Tangled around the elastic were several long, dark strands of her hair. I slipped those into a second plastic bag and zipped it shut. I placed both bags deep inside the inner pocket of my leather briefcase. I walked slowly back into the bright kitchen, kissed my wife gently on the cheek, and told her I loved her. The empty words tasted like bitter poison in my mouth, but she smiled warmly and kissed me back softly, telling me to have a very safe flight. I walked outside to my car, threw my heavy suitcase into the trunk, and drove away from the enormous mansion. I drove straight to the Denver International Airport, but I did not go to the ticketing counter. I parked my luxury sedan in the long-term parking garage, locked it, and left it there. Then I walked over to the ground transportation area and hailed a regular city cab. I paid the driver in cash, making sure there would be no credit card trails or digital receipts tied to my name. I gave him an obscure address on the complete opposite side of the sprawling city, far away from my wealthy suburban neighborhood. We drove for nearly an hour until we reached Aurora, Colorado. I had the driver drop me off at a cheap, rundown, cash-only motel right off the interstate highway. The kind of place with flickering neon signs and stained carpets. It was the perfect blind spot. I walked up to the bulletproof glass window, paid for 2 weeks in advance using $100 bills, and took the rusty metal key to room number 7. The room smelled of old smoke and cheap pine cleaner, but it did not matter. I set my briefcase on the wobbly wooden desk and opened it. I took out my laptop, my encrypted phone, and the 2 small plastic bags containing the hair samples. The structural inspection was officially underway. I held the 2 transparent plastic bags up to the light, staring at the tiny strands of hair that held the power to destroy my entire reality. Now I needed to hire a professional investigator, someone who knew exactly how to dig deep through the dirt without being seen. I made a phone call from an untraceable cell phone I had purchased at a dim gas station along the interstate. Within 2 hours, there was a heavy rhythmic knock on the wooden door of my motel room. I unlocked the deadbolt and let him inside. His name was Victor. He was not a flashy private detective with a cheap fedora and a camera hanging around his neck. Victor was a former senior auditor for the Internal Revenue Service who had been let go for being entirely too aggressive with his wealthy targets. He was a man who understood fundamentally that human beings will always lie to protect themselves, but financial records and biological science simply do not. He walked into the dingy room wearing a sharply tailored gray suit that contrasted sharply with the stained floral wallpaper and the cheap polyester bedspread. He did not ask why a man of my obvious wealth was hiding in a roadside motel in Aurora. He simply sat down in the plastic chair by the window, opened his worn leather briefcase, and waited quietly for my specific instructions. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress and looked him straight in the eye. I told him I needed 2 critical things, and I needed them done with absolute secrecy and terrifying speed. First, I reached deep into my coat pocket and pulled out the 2 plastic bags containing the hair samples. I placed them carefully on the desk between us. I told Victor I needed a definitive paternity test run immediately. I knew that standard medical laboratories could take several weeks to process genetic material, and they required a mountain of consent forms. But Victor operated outside of the standard legal systems. He had contacts in private diagnostic facilities who did not ask any questions as long as the cash payment was thick enough. I slid a heavy manila envelope containing $10,000 in unmarked $100 bills across the table. I instructed him to find out if the man who gave me those gray hair strands was the biological father of the young woman who owned the dark hair tie. Victor slipped the plastic bags into his breast pocket and nodded once, his expression unreadable and professional. Then I gave him my second directive. I told him about the $15 million commercial real estate retirement fund and the hidden file my wife had copied to a flash drive. I handed him a piece of paper with the IP address of my home network and the serial number of my desktop computer. I wanted him to trace every digital footprint, every bank ping, and every routing number associated with that file. I needed to know exactly where my money was going and who was waiting to receive it. Victor stood up, snapped his briefcase shut, and promised I would have concrete answers within 48 hours. When the heavy door clicked shut behind him, I was alone again, in the suffocating silence of the motel room. But I was not truly disconnected from my home. Before I had packed my leather travel bags and kissed my treacherous wife goodbye, I had made one final preparation. As an experienced structural engineer, I never rely on a single point of failure. Redundancy is the absolute key to any secure structure. While Patty had been busy making breakfast and fussing over Tommy in the kitchen, I had slipped a micro audio recorder underneath the heavy oak desk in my home office. It was a highly advanced military-grade listening device smaller than a standard matchbox equipped with a cellular transmitter that broadcasted a live audio feed directly to a secure application on my encrypted phone. I sat down at the wobbly motel desk, opened the surveillance app, and put on a pair of noise-canceling headphones. The screen displayed a dark interface with a single green sound wave undulating gently across the glass. For the first few hours, there was absolutely nothing but the ambient noise of the empty house, the distant hum of the central heating system kicking on and off, the steady rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. I waited very patiently, eating stale peanut butter crackers from the lobby vending machine, letting the quiet hours slip by into the late afternoon. Then, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon outside my dirty window, the green wave on my screen suddenly spiked violently. Someone had entered my home office. I pressed the headphones tighter against my ears, holding my breath so I could hear every single detail. I heard the distinct heavy creak of my expensive leather desk chair. Someone was sitting down in my seat. Then a voice broke through the static. It was Tommy. His tone was not weak, sick, or panicked like it had been at the hospital. He sounded incredibly relaxed, arrogant, and entirely in control of his surroundings. A moment later, Patty spoke. She asked him if he had secured the transfer protocols on his end. Her voice was cold, sharp, and businesslike, completely devoid of the sweet, worried wife persona she had worn just a few hours ago. I closed my eyes tightly as the bitter reality of their deception poured directly into my ears. They were laughing together, laughing at how easily I had bought the fake Seattle emergency, and laughing at how quickly I had run off to fix a broken building while my own life was being systematically dismantled behind my back. But then the laughter suddenly stopped, and the conversation shifted into something much darker and far more organized. Tommy leaned closer to the hidden microphone, his voice dropping into a low, predatory register. I gripped the edge of the cheap wooden desk so hard my knuckles turned completely white. He said, "As soon as that old fool gets back, we force him to sign the power of attorney. The Cayman accounts are ready." The words hung in the stale air of my motel room, echoing through my noise-canceling headphones like a death sentence. As soon as that old fool gets back, we force him to sign the power of attorney. The Cayman accounts are ready. I pulled the headphones off my ears and let them drop onto the cheap wooden desk. My breathing was heavy, ragged, and loud in the complete isolation of room number 7. They were not just having a secret affair. They were not just stealing a few $1,000s to fund a weekend getaway. They were orchestrating a hostile takeover of my entire existence. I stared at the peeling wallpaper, feeling a sickening mixture of profound grief and boiling volcanic rage. I had given them everything, and they were going to leave me with absolutely nothing. I spent the next 2 days trapped in that dingy room waiting for Victor to complete his forensic accounting. I paced back and forth across the stained carpet, watching the digital clock on the bedside table slowly tick away the hours. Every time my phone vibrated, my heart slammed against my ribs. Finally, on the evening of the second day, Victor began sending me the encrypted data packets. I opened my laptop and entered the secure passwords Victor had provided. Lines of code, IP addresses, and bank routing numbers flooded my screen. It was a digital map of my financial ruin. Victor had successfully traced the hidden file my wife had downloaded. My $15 million commercial real estate retirement fund was no longer a solid, impenetrable fortress. It was actively bleeding. I watched the live server pings as massive chunks of capital were being systematically unmoored from my domestic accounts and rerouted through a labyrinth of international wire transfers. Seeing those numbers flash across the screen broke something deep inside of me. That $15 million was not just a portfolio of diversified assets. It was the literal translation of my sweat, my youth, and my absence as a father. I closed my eyes and remembered the bitter winter of 1998. Valerie was 7 years old. She had her first major piano recital at the community theater. She had practiced for months wearing a little velvet dress, waiting for her father to walk through those auditorium doors. But I never made it. I was standing in freezing mud at a construction site downtown, reinforcing a concrete foundation that was severely behind schedule because I desperately needed the overtime pay. I remembered the smell of the wet concrete and the biting wind ripping through my heavy canvas jacket. I had convinced myself that physical suffering equaled true love. I thought that by destroying my own body, I was shielding hers. I needed that extra money to cover the massive legal fees for one of Tommy's spectacular real estate failures. I missed my daughter's recital. I missed her middle school graduation. I missed countless family dinners, anniversaries, and quiet Sunday mornings. I justified every single absence by telling myself I was building an unbreakable financial wall around my wife and my child. I believed I was securing Valerie's future. But looking at the offshore routing numbers on my glowing screen, the agonizing truth finally materialized. I had not been building a fortress for my family. I had been funding my treacherous brother's shadow empire brick by agonizing brick. The data Victor provided was meticulously organized. He had mapped out exactly how Patty and Tommy were executing the drain. They were using a sophisticated network of shell companies bouncing the funds through temporary holding accounts in Switzerland and Luxembourg before filtering them down to the Cayman Islands. Victor showed me the digital receipts. The transfers were masked as bogus consulting fees and phantom real estate acquisitions. It was a masterpiece of corporate fraud. They were moving just fast enough to avoid triggering automatic federal banking flags, but steady enough to empty the entire $15 million before my supposed 2-week trip to Seattle was over. They needed my signature on that power of attorney document merely as a legal fail-safe, a blanket authorization to protect themselves from criminal prosecution once the money was fully secured overseas. I sat in the dark, bathed only in the pale blue light of the monitor, watching the legacy of my life be dismantled by the two people I loved most. The betrayal was so absolute, so flawlessly executed, that for a brief moment I actually felt a dark sense of awe. They had played the long game. Every smile, every kiss, every tear Patty had shed over the years was a calculated investment toward this exact financial payout. I rubbed my exhausted eyes and poured myself a glass of lukewarm tap water from the bathroom sink. I was tired, but the adrenaline in my veins refused to let me sleep. The digital clock shifted to 2 in the morning. The motel was dead silent save for the roar of an 18-wheeler passing by outside. Suddenly, the burner phone resting on the desk vibrated aggressively, shattering the quiet. The caller ID simply read Victor. I snatched the phone and pressed it to my ear. I did not even say hello. I just waited for him to speak. His voice was gravelly, strictly professional, but carrying an unmistakable weight of grim finality. "Mr. Stanton," he said slowly, "I have successfully tracked the primary endpoint of the offshore transfers. The final shell company receiving your retirement funds is registered under your wife's maiden name. She is the sole beneficial owner of the Cayman accounts." I absorbed this information, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. I told him I understood. But then Victor took a slow, heavy breath. "That is not the worst part. The laboratory just finished expediting the biological samples you gave me. I need you to open your email right now and check the encrypted file I just sent you. Check the DNA results." The phone slipped from my grasp, landing with a soft thud on the motel desk. I stared at the screen of my laptop, my chest tight and my breath trapped in my throat. Victor had sent a secure email. The subject line was completely blank. Attached to the message was a single document from the private diagnostic laboratory. I moved the cursor over the file icon. My hand was shaking so violently that it took me 3 attempts to double-click it open. The document loaded onto the screen, glowing against the darkness of the room. It was filled with complex medical terminology columns of genetic markers and long alphanumeric codes that meant nothing to me. But at the bottom of the page, highlighted in bold text, was the final inescapable conclusion. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. The man who provided the gray hair samples was the biological father of the young woman who owned the dark hair tie. Valerie was not my daughter. She was Tommy's child. I pushed the laptop away as if it had caught fire. I stood up, stumbling backward until my shoulders hit the thin, peeling wall of the motel room. My legs completely gave out beneath me. I slid down the wall and hit the carpet. For the first time since this nightmare began, I completely broke down. The tears came hot and fast, blinding me, choking me. A raw, guttural sob tore its way out of my chest, echoing off the cheap wooden furniture. I pressed my hands against my face, but the pain was absolute. 40 years. My entire identity as a father, my entire purpose for existing, was nothing but a meticulously fabricated lie. I closed my eyes tightly, and the memories flooded into my mind, twisting like jagged, rusted knives in my gut. I remembered the cold, snowy night she was born. I remembered standing in the bright delivery room, wearing uncomfortable blue hospital scrubs, terrified and awestruck, as the tired nurse placed that tiny, fragile bundle of blankets into my arms. I had looked down at her face, her dark hair, and made a silent, sacred vow to protect her from the cruel world. I promised to give her absolutely everything I never had growing up. I remembered teaching her how to ride a pink bicycle on the concrete sidewalk in front of our very first house. I remembered running behind her, holding the seat to keep her balanced until my lungs burned, and she was finally pedaling on her own, laughing into the wind. I remembered the crippling financial stress of paying for her expensive undergraduate degree, and then the staggering cost of her medical school tuition. I had worked myself to the bare bone, taking on every grueling structural engineering contract I could possibly find. I missed vacations. I skipped sleep, and I destroyed my knees climbing frozen scaffolds just to ensure she graduated from medical school without a single penny of student loan debt. I had loved her unconditionally, with every single fiber of my being, believing she was the best part of me. But the woman I proudly called my wife had looked me directly in the eyes every single day for 35 years, knowing the truth. Patty knew. She watched me sacrifice my youth and my health. She watched me work 80-hour weeks to provide for a child that belonged to the brother I was already subsidizing. She let me pay for everything, let me build a life for them, while she secretly carried on her disgusting affair with Tommy. The sheer magnitude of the deception was physically agonizing. It felt as though a massive steel girder had snapped in half, crashing down onto my chest, crushing my lungs, and leaving me gasping for oxygen in the pitch-black dark. How could two human beings be so profoundly evil? How could they sit at my Thanksgiving dinner table, drink my wine, and smile at me while harboring such a monstrous secret? They had not merely stolen my retirement money. They had stolen my entire legacy. They had allowed me to pour my heart, my soul, and my finite time on this earth into a child that was created entirely from their betrayal. I sat on the floor of that dingy motel room for hours, weeping until my eyes were swollen shut and my throat was raw and bleeding. I mourned the beautiful daughter I genuinely thought I had. I mourned the honorable life I thought I had built with my own two hands. I felt pathetic, foolish, and incredibly small. But eventually, the heavy tears stopped falling. The crushing weight of the agonizing grief began to harden into something else entirely. I pulled myself up from the dirty floor, my joints aching, my muscles stiff and sore. I walked slowly over to the small bathroom sink and turned the rusty faucet. I splashed freezing cold water onto my face, washing away the salt and the misery. I looked at my reflection in the cracked, yellowed mirror. The man staring back at me was no longer a heartbroken father or a tragically betrayed husband. He was a master structural engineer. And engineers do not sit around weeping over broken concrete and shattered glass. We do not mourn a collapsed bridge. We analyze the critical failure points. We assess the structural integrity of whatever remains standing in the rubble. And then we bring in the heavy machinery to tear it all down. I dried my face with a rough, cheap towel, my hands perfectly steady now. The suffocating sorrow in my chest completely evaporated swiftly, replaced by a cold, calculating, and ruthless logic. My family was a structurally flawed building, constructed on a deep foundation of lies held together by nothing but greed, manipulation, and deception. It was dangerous, it was toxic, and it was entirely beyond repair. There was only one logical thing left to do. A flawed building must be demolished. The morning sun was just beginning to bleach the sky outside my motel window when a sharp, heavy knock rattled the wooden door. I had spent the rest of the night packing my emotions into tight, impenetrable boxes. I opened the door. Victor was standing there holding a thick manila envelope. He did not look like the detached, calculating investigator from 2 days ago. His face was grim, his shoulders rigid. He stepped into the room without waiting for an invitation and locked the deadbolt behind him. I offered him a seat, but he refused. He stood in the center of the cramped room, staring at me with an expression that bordered on genuine pity. I told him I had already seen the email. I told him I knew about Valerie. I expected him to nod and finalize his invoice, but instead, he tightened his grip on the envelope. He told me the DNA results were only a piece of the puzzle. To fully map out the Cayman Islands shell company, he had to dig deep into my wife's financial past, tracking her maiden name across state lines to find the original incorporation documents. What he found, buried in the dusty municipal archives of another state, was something he felt he had to deliver in person. Victor placed the manila envelope on the wobbly desk. He told me that when people set up offshore accounts to hide stolen assets, they usually make a mistake at the very beginning of the paper trail. Patty made her mistake 42 years ago. Victor explained that he had run a comprehensive background check on her maiden name, cross-referencing it with Tommy's known associates and past residential addresses. The trail led him far away from Colorado and straight into the blistering desert. Specifically, it led to the Clark County Archives in Nevada. I stared at the brown envelope. It looked completely ordinary, yet it radiated a dark, magnetic pull. Victor urged me to open it. My fingers were perfectly steady this time. I undid the metal clasp and pulled out a single stiff piece of paper. It was a certified photocopy of an official government record. The state seal of Nevada was stamped prominently at the top. It was a marriage certificate. I read the names printed in faded typewriter ink. The groom was Thomas William Stanton. The bride was Patricia Ann Miller. The date of the ceremony was exactly 42 years ago. 2 years before I ever met the woman I thought was my wife. 2 years before she bumped into me at a local coffee shop, smiled that beautiful smile, and began the meticulous process of dismantling my future. I read the document again, my brain struggling to process the sheer audacity of the ink on the page. They were married. My brother and my wife had gone to Las Vegas and entered into a legally binding marriage. I looked up at Victor, my voice barely a whisper, and asked him if they had ever annulled it. Victor shook his head slowly. He told me he had scoured every county court database in the country. There was absolutely no record of a divorce decree, no annulment, no legal separation. They were still legally husband and wife. The suffocating silence in the small motel room became absolute and heavy. The implications of that piece of paper began to cascade through my mind, aligning perfectly, like the gears of a massive heavy machine. Almost exactly 40 years ago, I stood in front of an altar, in front of God and my closest friends, and promised my life to Patty. We signed a marriage license in the state of Colorado. But that license was built on a criminal deception. By the laws of the United States government, a person cannot be married to 2 individuals at the same time. The legal term is bigamy, and it is a serious felony. My 40-year marriage to Patty was a complete legal fiction. It never actually existed in the eyes of the law, not for a single second. I was not a heartbroken husband going through a bitter, emotionally devastating divorce. I was just an unmarried man who had been systematically and maliciously defrauded by a legally married couple. I walked over to the window and looked out at the busy highway, feeling an entirely unfamiliar sensation spreading rapidly through my chest. It was not sorrow. It was not despair. It was sheer, unadulterated power. In a standard messy divorce, a wife living in the state of Colorado is legally entitled to 50% of all community property acquired during the marriage. Patty had been banking her entire strategy on that specific legal protection. She had been secretly stealing the $15 million retirement fund because she believed she had a permanent legal shield. She thought she was simply hiding marital assets before dropping the final hammer on me and walking away clean. But this single sheet of paper completely annihilated her shield. Because our marriage was legally void from the very first day we stood at the altar. Patty was never my spouse. She had absolutely zero legal rights to my massive house, my successful engineering company, or my retirement fund. Every single dollar she had ever authorized to be transferred overseas was not a complicated division of marital assets. It was an unauthorized malicious theft executed by a complete corporate outsider. She had deliberately used federal banking channels to move $15 million that she had absolutely no legal claim to. It was federal wire fraud on a truly massive scale. I turned back to Victor, a cold, sharp smile slowly forming on my face. My treacherous brother and his legal wife thought they had successfully trapped a foolish old man. But they had just handed me the exact tools I needed to permanently bury them both alive in a cold, federal prison for the remainder of their absolutely miserable, worthless, natural lives. I left the motel an hour later, leaving Victor behind to continue monitoring the server traffic. I drove my rental car to a private members-only cigar lounge in downtown Denver. It was a place I used to frequent in my early days of building the firm, a quiet sanctuary with thick mahogany walls, dim lighting, and the heavy scent of aged tobacco. I had called Harrison, my lead corporate attorney, and told him to meet me in the private back room. Harrison had been with my engineering firm for over 2 decades. He was a brilliant, meticulous lawyer who knew every single detail of my corporate structure. When he arrived, he looked extremely worried. He sat down in the leather armchair across from me, ordering a tall glass of scotch, and asked me what was so urgent that it could not wait for a proper meeting at the office. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I slid the manila envelope across the low wooden table. I told him to look at the document inside. Harrison opened the envelope and carefully pulled out the Nevada marriage certificate. He adjusted his glasses, reading the faded ink. I watched his face transition from mild confusion to absolute unadulterated horror. He looked up at me, his mouth slightly open, and asked if this was some kind of sick joke. I told him it was the reality I had been living in for 40 years. I explained everything. I told him about the fake heart attack, the stolen flash drive, the offshore Cayman accounts, and the DNA test that proved my daughter was actually my niece. Harrison sat perfectly still, his glass of scotch completely forgotten. For a man who made a living navigating complex corporate litigation, he looked entirely out of his depth. He leaned forward, his voice trembling with genuine outrage, and told me we needed to contact the federal authorities immediately. He said we had to call the police, freeze the bank accounts, and have Patty and Tommy arrested for bigamy and grand larceny before the sun went down. I shook my head slowly, taking a sip of my own drink. I told him no. I refused to call the police. Harrison looked at me as if I had lost my mind. He argued that if we did not act right now, the $15 million would be permanently lost in the Cayman Islands. He said international asset recovery lawsuits could take a decade, and even then we might only recover a fraction of the money. I listened to his panicked legal advice, feeling that same cold, calculated calmness spreading through my veins. I explained to Harrison that calling the cops would trigger a massive public legal battle. It would drag my company name through the mud. It would give Tommy and Patty time to hire defense lawyers, time to plead for leniency, time to drag out the process. I did not want a messy, prolonged divorce or a tedious fraud trial. I wanted absolute, instantaneous destruction. I wanted them to feel the exact same level of helplessness that I had felt when I looked at that DNA result. I leaned across the table, looking directly into Harrison's eyes, and told him we were going to weaponize the engineering firm corporate structure. I asked him to clarify the legal status of the $15 million retirement fund. He stuttered for a moment, then explained that the fund was technically a corporate holding account, managed by my firm, but fully authorized for domestic transfer by my spouse. That was the critical flaw. I pointed at the marriage certificate resting on the table. I reminded him that the woman who initiated the transfer was not my spouse. Because the marriage was legally void, Patty was nothing more than a corporate outsider. She had absolutely no authorized access to that fund. By using my personal computer to download the routing numbers and initiate the transfers, she had committed a direct cyber attack against my company. And she was using my brother's social security number and signature to finalize the offshore holding accounts. This was not just a family betrayal. This was a federal crime being committed against a registered corporation. Every single digital footprint they left behind was another nail in their coffin. They thought they were outsmarting an old, tired man who was too blind to see what was happening right in front of him. But they forgot that I spent my entire life designing structures meant to withstand earthquakes and hurricanes. I knew exactly how to find the weak points in their plan. And I knew exactly how to exploit them until their entire world crumbled into dust. I was going to use their own greed to lock them inside a prison of their own making. I looked at Harrison, watching his mind process the sheer scale of the legal trap I was proposing. Harrison slowly began to understand what I was saying. The outrage on his face was replaced by the sharp, analytical focus of a corporate predator. He realized this was not a domestic dispute over a joint bank account. This was an unauthorized corporate wire transfer across international borders. He was still worried about the money. He warned me that the funds were already moving through Switzerland. By the end of the week, the money would land in the Cayman Shell Company, completely out of our jurisdiction. I smiled, a dark expression that felt unfamiliar on my own face. I leaned back in my leather chair and gave my attorney the final devastating piece of the blueprint. I told him to let them steal the $15 million. But we are going to change the legal classification of that money before it ever lands in their offshore account. Harrison stared at me, his legal mind racing to catch up with my engineering logic. I explained that we were going to execute a retroactive corporate maneuver. I owned the engineering firm entirely, which meant I had the executive power to reassign internal corporate debt. The $15 million retirement fund was currently classified as liquid corporate savings. But with Harrison's help, we were going to officially reclassify that entire sum as a high-risk corporate loan. Harrison pulled a legal pad from his briefcase, his pen flying across the paper as he began drafting the preliminary structure. He explained that we could draft a binding financial agreement, dating it back to the exact moment Patty initiated the first digital transfer. By moving that money, Tommy and Patty were no longer stealing a retirement fund. They were legally accepting the terms of a massive, heavily documented financial loan. But I did not just want them to owe my company the money. If they owed me, they could try to declare bankruptcy and drag me into civil court. I wanted them to owe someone far more ruthless. I instructed Harrison to immediately sell this newly created corporate debt to Vanguard Debt Collection. Vanguard was a predatory venture capital firm and private debt acquisition agency that my company had occasionally used to hunt down bankrupt contractors. They were notorious for their relentless, bloodthirsty pursuit of corporate assets. They did not negotiate. They did not accept apologies. They simply liquidated the lives of the people who owed them money. Harrison's eyes widened. He warned me that if we transferred the ownership of the fund to Vanguard, I would permanently lose the $15 million. I would be giving away my entire life savings just to ensure my brother and my fake wife were destroyed. I looked around the quiet, dimly lit room, thinking about the decades I had spent freezing on construction scaffolds. I thought about the thousands of hours I had sacrificed for a family that despised me. I realized that the money had always been a prison. It was the very thing that kept me tied to their endless greed. I did not want the money anymore. I wanted my freedom, and I was more than willing to pay $15 million to buy it. I told Harrison to draft the paperwork immediately. For the next 8 hours, we sat in that private room, drinking black coffee and meticulously building the legal trap. Harrison contacted the senior partners at Vanguard Debt Collection, explaining that we had a massive high-interest corporate loan that was currently being wired to an offshore account. He provided them with Tommy's social security number, which Patty had conveniently used to set up the intermediate shell companies. Because Tommy was the registered recipient of the funds, the debt was legally bound directly to him. The paperwork was airtight. It was an absolute masterpiece of corporate financial engineering. The money Patty and Tommy were gleefully transferring out of my accounts was now officially a high-yield unsecured loan with a predatory interest rate of 22%. The moment the funds settled into their Cayman Islands account, the debt would officially mature. Vanguard would immediately file a federal injunction locking the offshore accounts and seizing whatever domestic assets Tommy and Patty had left to cover the massive interest penalties. And because Patty had used unauthorized access to initiate the transfer, Vanguard would also forward the entire file to the Federal Bureau of Investigation for international wire fraud. By the time the sun came up the next morning, the contract was completely finalized. I signed the heavy stack of corporate transfer documents, legally severing myself from the $15 million. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of relief wash over my tired body. The massive weight I had carried on my shoulders for 40 years was suddenly gone. The trap was perfectly set, and the concrete had officially been poured. There was absolutely no way out for them. They were happily digging their own financial graves, entirely unaware that the gold they thought they were stealing was actually toxic waste. I thanked Harrison, shook his hand, and walked out of the cigar lounge into the bright Denver morning. Now the structural calculations were finished. The only thing left to do was to go back to my beautiful, empty mansion, look my treacherous wife in the eyes, and play the part of the senile, broken old victim until the building collapsed on top of them. I got into my rental car and drove back to the motel to pack my bags. Victor had already left, leaving the room key on the desk. I gathered my things, my laptop, and the encrypted files containing the DNA results and the marriage certificate. I drove back to the airport, returned the rental, and retrieved my luxury sedan from the long-term parking garage. I sat in the driver's seat for a few moments, staring at the steering wheel, taking slow, deep breaths. I had to bury the engineer and become the vulnerable old man they expected me to be. I messed up my hair, unbuttoned my collar, and rubbed my eyes until they were red and puffy. I practiced my lines in the rearview mirror. I had to look confused, defeated, and utterly lost. When I finally pulled into the long driveway of my home, the mansion looked like a giant tombstone. I parked the car, grabbed my leather suitcase, and walked slowly toward the front door. My hands were perfectly steady. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house was quiet, but I could hear the faint sound of the television coming from the living room. Patty was sitting on the sofa sipping tea. She turned her head as I walked in, her face immediately shifting into a mask of fake concern. She stood up, rushing over to me, asking why I was home so early from Seattle. I let my shoulders slump, dropping my suitcase heavily onto the floor. I looked at her with empty, tired eyes, ready to deliver the performance of a lifetime and seal their absolute destruction. I let my suitcase hit the hardwood floor with a heavy, lifeless thud. I slouched my shoulders, forcing my spine to curve slightly, instantly stripping away the commanding posture I had maintained for 40 years. Patty practically ran across the living room, her expensive silk robe flowing behind her. She grabbed my arm, her voice pitched high with manufactured worry. She asked me what was wrong, why I was home nearly a week early, and why I had not called her from the airport to send a car. I did not look her in the eyes right away. I let my gaze wander aimlessly around the grand foyer as if I did not quite recognize the artwork on the walls or the crystal chandelier hanging above us. I blinked slowly, rubbing my forehead with a trembling hand. I told her I did not know. My voice was intentionally soft, raspy, and tinged with genuine fear. I told her that Seattle was a complete disaster. I said I walked out of the active construction site on the second day to get a simple cup of coffee, and suddenly the city streets did not make any sense to me. Patty tightened her grip on my arm. I could feel the sudden spike of adrenaline in her pulse. I leaned heavily against the entryway table, breathing shallowly. I told her I spent 6 hours wandering the downtown commercial district in the freezing rain. I told her I could not remember the name of my hotel. I could not remember my room number or where I had left my briefcase. I said I had to find a transit police officer to help me call the airline and just get me on the absolutely first flight back to Denver. I looked up at her, then making sure my eyes were wide, glassy, and completely vulnerable, I whispered that my brain felt like it was full of thick, gray fog. I told her I looked at the structural blueprints for the new high-rise, and the numbers just swam off the page. I could not calculate the basic load weights. I could not remember the mathematical formulas I had used every single day since I was 20 years old. As I poured out this pathetic, fabricated confession, I watched her face very closely. She arranged her features into a mask of deep, devastating sorrow. She reached up and stroked my damp hair, cooing soft words of comfort. But I saw it. Just for a fraction of a second, her eyes darted over my shoulder toward the hallway. Tommy had emerged from the guest bedroom, alerted by the sound of my early arrival. He was standing near the archway, wearing a pair of my expensive silk pajamas. Patty and Tommy exchanged a single fleeting look. It was not a look of concern. It was a look of absolute triumphant victory. They thought my mind was finally breaking down. They thought the decades of immense stress and overwork had finally triggered early onset dementia. It was the perfect miraculous excuse they needed to execute their final maneuver without raising any suspicions from my colleagues or the local authorities. Tommy immediately rushed forward, shifting effortlessly into the role of the devoted, terrified younger brother. He grabbed my other arm, his face etched with fake panic. He told me I was freezing, that my skin was pale, and that I needed to sit down immediately before I collapsed. Together, my treacherous wife and my parasitic brother gently guided me into the formal dining room. They pulled out a chair at the head of the heavy mahogany table and helped me sit down, treating me like a fragile piece of glass that was about to shatter into a million pieces. Patty scurried into the kitchen to brew a pot of chamomile tea, while Tommy stood beside me, resting a heavy, comforting hand on my shoulder. He patted me gently, telling me over and over that everything was going to be all right, that I was just exhausted from carrying the weight of the company for far too long. I slumped in the chair, staring blankly at the polished wood of the table. I let my hands shake visibly as I rested them on my lap. I muttered quietly, repeating that I did not understand what was happening to me, that I was completely terrified of losing my mind. Patty returned with a steaming mug of tea, setting it carefully in front of me. She knelt beside my chair, taking my trembling hand in hers. She told me I had worked too hard for too many years. She said it was time for me to finally rest, to let go of the immense pressure of running the engineering firm, and to let my family take care of me for a change. I nodded slowly, squeezing her hand, playing the part of a man desperately clinging to his loving wife as his reality slipped away. Tommy walked around to the opposite side of the dining table. He opened his leather briefcase, which was sitting on one of the chairs. The trap was springing perfectly. They were so blinded by their own greed and their absolute certainty that I was a broken old man that they did not even bother to wait a few days. They wanted to lock the cage while I was still completely disoriented. I watched through half-closed eyes as Tommy pulled out a thick, legally bound stack of documents. The paper was crisp and bright under the dining room chandelier. He walked back over and gently placed the thick stack of papers on the dining table directly in front of me. He pulled a heavy gold pen from his shirt pocket and laid it carefully on top of the documents. He leaned down, placing both hands on the table, and looked at me with an expression of deep manufactured sorrow. "Richard, buddy, your mind is slipping. You need to sign this power of attorney so Patty and I can protect your company." I stared at the thick stack of legal documents resting on the mahogany dining table. The heavy gold pen gleamed under the warm light of the chandelier. I looked up at Tommy, letting my lower lip tremble just enough to be convincing. I did not reach for the pen immediately. I needed to make them work for it. I needed them to believe that they were breaking down the final defensive walls of a proud, stubborn man. I let a single tear slip from the corner of my eye, tracking slowly down my wrinkled cheek. I looked at Patty, my voice cracking perfectly, as I asked her if this was truly the end. I asked her if signing those papers meant I was officially useless, a broken old machine ready to be thrown onto the scrap heap. Patty rushed forward and knelt beside my chair. She reached up and kissed my forehead. It was a cold, deliberate Judas kiss. She stroked my hair and looked deeply into my eyes, pouring every ounce of her remaining acting talent into that single moment. She told me I would never be useless. She promised me that she and Tommy were simply taking the heavy burden off my tired shoulders. She whispered that they were going to protect everything I had built, and that I could finally rest, knowing my legacy was safe in the hands of the people who loved me most. The sheer audacity of her lie was staggering, but I swallowed my disgust and nodded slowly. I reached out with a violently shaking hand and picked up the gold pen. The metal felt heavy and cold between my fingers. I hovered the tip of the pen over the signature line on the first page of the power of attorney document. I paused for one agonizing second, letting them hold their breath, before I pressed the ink to the paper. I signed my name. My signature was intentionally messy, the letters trailing off weakly at the end, perfectly reflecting the cognitive decline I was pretending to suffer from. I flipped to the next page and signed again. I repeated this slow, pathetic process across 12 different pages of legal authorization. The moment I lifted the pen from the final signature line, the atmosphere in the room completely shifted. Tommy could not contain himself. He practically lunged forward physically, snatching the stack of documents right off the table. He did not even bother to say thank you. He stood up straight, clutching the papers to his chest, a greedy, triumphant smirk spreading across his face. He looked at Patty, and she smiled back at him, her eyes shining with absolute victory. I slumped back in my chair, burying my face in my hands, pretending to weep quietly. Patty patted my shoulder one last time, her touch completely devoid of the warmth she had faked just moments ago. She told me to go upstairs to the master bedroom and get some sleep. I stood up slowly, dragging my feet across the floor, and walked up the grand staircase. I closed the bedroom door behind me, but I did not go to sleep. I walked into my walk-in closet, pulled out my encrypted phone, and launched the audio surveillance application. I sat on the floor in the dark, pressed the noise-canceling headphones over my ears, and waited for the real celebration to begin. Downstairs in the living room, I had paid for my treacherous wife and my parasitic brother were reveling in their ultimate victory. Through the wiretap, I heard the distinct sharp pop of a cork. They had opened a bottle of vintage champagne. Not just any champagne. It was the extremely rare, expensive bottle I had specifically purchased for our 40th wedding anniversary. I listened to the clinking of crystal glasses. I heard Patty laugh, a high, sharp sound that echoed with pure malice. She told Tommy that she could not believe how incredibly easy it was. She mocked the way my hands were shaking, calling me a pathetic, gullible old fool. Tommy laughed with her, his voice dripping with arrogance and superiority. He boasted that he had finally taken everything from the older brother, who always thought he was so much better than him. They drank my champagne sitting in my house, celebrating the theft of my life. I sat in the darkness of the closet, my face completely dry, listening to every single word. I needed to hear it. I needed their cruelty to burn away any lingering hesitation in my soul. Then the clinking of glasses stopped. Tommy took a deep breath, his tone shifting from celebratory to strictly business. The trap was locked, and he was ready to execute the final phase of their hostile takeover. I gripped my phone as his voice came through the headphones loud and perfectly clear. "Call Valerie," he ordered. "Tell her we are holding a family board meeting tomorrow morning to officially strip his title." The morning sun rose over Denver, casting a sharp, blinding light across the steel and glass skyline. I woke up long before Patty or Tommy stirred in the mansion. I did not wear the casual, disheveled clothes I had worn the day before. I walked into my closet and selected my finest custom-tailored Italian suit. It was a dark charcoal gray wool suit that fit my frame with absolute perfection. I chose a crisp white shirt, a conservative silk tie, and polished my black leather Oxfords until they gleamed like dark mirrors. When I looked in the full-length mirror, the senile, broken old man was completely gone. The structural engineer, the man who had built an empire from the ground up, was staring back at me. I looked sharper, stronger, and significantly more dangerous than I had in 30 years. I slipped my gold watch onto my wrist, grabbed my leather briefcase containing the explosive evidence, and quietly left the house before they even woke up. I drove my luxury sedan through the busy downtown traffic, pulling into the private underground parking garage of Stanton Engineering. The building itself was a testament to my life's work. I had designed the structural framework for this very tower. Walking through the marble lobby, the security guards and front desk receptionists nodded to me with deep respect. I took the private executive elevator up to the top floor. The corporate headquarters was quiet this early in the morning. I walked down the long carpeted hallway toward the main boardroom. The boardroom was a massive, imposing space with floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooking the magnificent Colorado mountains. A long, polished mahogany table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by high-backed leather executive chairs. I did not go inside. Instead, I went into my private office down the hall, locked the door, and waited for the rats to willingly walk into the trap. By 9 o'clock, the boardroom began to fill. I monitored the hallway through the internal security cameras on my tablet. Tommy was the first to arrive. He strode down the corridor wearing a flashy, ill-fitting suit, carrying the signed power of attorney documents like a trophy. He walked straight into the glass-walled boardroom and confidently sat down in my chair. The chair at the very head of the table, the seat of absolute power. Patty arrived a few minutes later dressed in a sharp, professional blazer, looking every bit the part of the concerned, capable matriarch, taking charge of a tragic family situation. She sat directly to his right. Then the elevator doors opened, and Valerie stepped out. My heart gave a slight, painful tug as I watched her walk down the hall. She looked incredibly tired, her eyes red and puffy. Patty had clearly spent the morning manipulating her, feeding her lies about my rapid cognitive decline, and insisting that this legal maneuver was the only way to save me from myself. Valerie walked into the boardroom and took a seat opposite her mother, completely unaware that her entire biological reality was about to be shattered into a million pieces. The final person to enter the room was Harrison, my lead corporate attorney. He carried his heavy leather briefcase and wore a perfectly neutral expression. He had received my instructions the night before. He knew exactly what was about to happen, and he was ready to play his part in the demolition. Harrison took his seat near the center of the table, opening his legal pad. Tommy leaned forward, placing his elbows on the polished mahogany. He looked around the room with an expression of supreme authority. He cleared his throat, enjoying the sound of his own voice echoing in the large executive space. He slid the signed power of attorney documents across the table toward Harrison. The arrogance in his posture was palpable. He looked at Valerie, putting on a face of fake sympathy before addressing the attorney. As of today, Tommy declared smoothly, his voice ringing with absolute confidence. My brother is medically incompetent. Patty and I are taking full control of Stanton Engineering and its liquid assets. Harrison looked down at the documents, adjusting his glasses, but he did not speak. The silence in the boardroom stretched out, heavy and expectant. Tommy waited for the attorney to validate his hostile takeover. Patty reached over and gently patted Valerie's hand, playing the role of the grieving wife. They thought they had won. They thought the empire was finally theirs. But they were entirely wrong. I stood up from my desk in my private office. I smoothed the lapels of my charcoal Italian suit. I picked up my leather briefcase and walked out into the hallway. My footsteps were silent on the thick carpet as I approached the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. I did not hesitate. I did not knock. I pushed the double doors open with a firm, powerful thrust. The heavy glass swung wide and I stepped into the room. I stood tall, my shoulders squared, my posture absolutely perfect. I was no longer slouched. I was not trembling. I looked directly at Tommy, who was sitting in my chair. The arrogant smirk instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a look of profound, paralyzing shock. I walked slowly toward the head of the table, wearing my best custom Italian suit. I looked sharper and more dangerous than I have in 30 years. I walked slowly toward the head of the table. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was the kind of thick silence that precedes a structural collapse. The echo of my Oxfords on the polished floor was the only sound in the room. I did not look like a man whose mind was slipping into the fog of dementia. I moved with the calculated grace of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. I stopped right next to the leather chair where Tommy was sitting. My brother stared up at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He tried to speak, tried to muster some of the arrogant bravado he had been parading around just moments ago, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He pressed his back hard against the leather upholstery, leaning away from me. Patty sat, frozen to his right. The caring matriarch persona she had so carefully constructed was fracturing right before my eyes. Her perfectly painted lips parted in silent disbelief. She looked at my steady hands, my squared shoulders, and the cold clarity in my eyes. The fake smile she had been wearing faltered, slipping right off her face like a cheap mask. She knew instantly that the trembling old man from the night before had been a complete fabrication. She realized I had played her. I turned my gaze across the table to Valerie, my beautiful, brilliant daughter. She was gripping the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles white. She looked at me, confusion warring with a sudden spark of profound realization. She had spent the entire morning agonizing over my supposed mental deterioration. But as she looked into my eyes now, she saw the sharp intelligence of the father who had raised her. She let out a small, trembling breath. She knew I was not sick, but she did not yet understand why I was standing there looking like a man preparing for war. Tommy finally managed to find his voice. He puffed out his chest, trying to project authority, but his voice was thin and shaky. "Richard, what are you doing here? You should be at home resting. The paperwork is already signed. I am the acting executive of this firm now." I did not even dignify his desperate blustering with a direct response. I simply ignored his existence entirely. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my encrypted mobile phone, and placed it face down on the table. Then I turned my attention back to my treacherous wife. "Patty," I said, my voice ringing out with absolute clarity. It was the voice I used to command hundreds of men on chaotic construction sites. It was loud, steady, and completely devoid of any warmth. "You really should have checked the blueprints before you decided to tear down my life. You thought I was broken. You thought I was blind. But you made a catastrophic miscalculation." Patty swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward Harrison. The attorney sat completely still, his hands folded neatly over his pad, his face carved from stone. Tommy slammed his hand down on the table, trying one last time to seize control. He stood up, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "Listen to me, you crazy old man. We have the power of attorney. You signed it yourself. You gave us full control of the assets. You cannot just walk in here and undo a legally binding contract because you suddenly feel better today. We are in charge now." I looked at Tommy. I let a cold smile spread across my face. "You wanted to control my assets, Tommy?" I asked, my voice dropping into a lethal register. You wanted to take over my empire. You really should have checked the load-bearing walls first. Without breaking eye contact with my brother, I raised my right hand and gave a sharp nod to Harrison. The corporate attorney did not hesitate. He stood up from his chair, walked over to the heavy glass double doors of the boardroom, and pushed the thick metal locking mechanism. A loud click echoed through the room. He locked the boardroom doors from the inside. We were entirely sealed off from the rest of the corporate headquarters. No one was coming in, and absolutely no one was getting out. Patty gasped, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Tommy sank back down into his chair, his face turning the color of wet ash. Valerie looked back and forth between us, her medical training finally kicking in, as she recognized the physical symptoms of sheer panic radiating from her mother and her uncle. She asked me what was going on, her voice trembling with rising fear. I looked at her, my heart breaking all over again, but I knew I had to finish the demolition. The truth had to be exposed to the light. I walked over to the media console built into the edge of the mahogany table. I opened my leather briefcase and pulled out my sleek silver laptop. I plugged the primary display cable directly into the side of the machine. I pressed a single button on the console panel. The heavy blackout blinds on the floor-to-ceiling glass windows automatically began to lower, plunging the boardroom into a dramatic, tense shadow. At the far end of the long table, a massive projection screen slowly descended from the ceiling. Tommy was sweating profusely now. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, stammering about calling building security. Patty was breathing in short, rapid gasps. They both assumed I was going to project a financial document. They thought I had somehow intercepted the bank routing numbers or found the digital logs of their Cayman Islands shell company. They braced themselves for a fight over money, preparing to argue that the $15 million was marital property. But I was not going to argue about money. I was going to obliterate their entire reality. I typed my password into the laptop and opened the encrypted folder Victor had given me. I double-clicked on the first file. The projector hummed to life, casting a bright, blinding square of light onto the massive screen at the end of the room. It was not a financial ledger. It was not a bank statement. It was the scanned, certified photocopy of a very old, very official government document from the Clark County Archives. I stepped back, letting the projection illuminate the terrified faces of my wife and my brother. It was the Nevada marriage certificate. The enormous projection screen bathed the entire boardroom in a stark, unforgiving white light. The image displayed was perfectly focused, magnifying every single typewritten letter and official stamp of the document so that no one in the room could possibly deny what they were looking at. The Great Seal of the state of Nevada glowed brightly near the top of the canvas. Below it, the names were printed in the unmistakable blocky font of an old-fashioned typewriter. Thomas William Stanton. Patricia Ann Miller. The room froze. The air grew so thick and heavy that it felt as though the oxygen had been completely sucked out of the executive suite. The only sound was the soft, steady hum of the projector cooling fan above our heads. I stood at the head of the mahogany table, my hands resting lightly on the polished wood. I looked around the room, taking in the absolute devastation I had just unleashed. I turned my attention to the projection and began to read the document aloud. My voice was calm, resonant, and entirely devoid of the trembling weakness I had faked the day before. I read the date of the ceremony, emphasizing the year. It was exactly 42 years ago. I read the location of the chapel in Las Vegas. I read the signatures of the witness and the officiating minister. Every word I spoke landed like a physical blow against the people sitting at the table. When I finished reading the certificate, I turned my gaze slowly toward Patty. She was staring at the screen, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to hollow out her entire face. The color had completely drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin a sickly, chalky white. Her meticulously styled hair and her expensive designer blazer suddenly looked absurd, like a costume worn by a desperate imposter. I kept my eyes locked on hers, as I delivered the final crushing legal reality. You have been legally married to my brother. For 42 years, Patty, I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. You went to Las Vegas. You took his name and you never filed for a divorce, which means under the strict family laws of Colorado State, our 40-year marriage is nothing more than a fraudulent fiction. You committed bigamy. You are not my wife. You have never been my legal wife. And because you are not my spouse, you have absolutely zero community property rights. You are entitled to nothing. Not my house, not my company, and certainly not my retirement savings. The moment the words registered in her brain, Patty snapped. The carefully maintained facade of the caring, dignified matriarch violently shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She jumped up from her leather executive chair so fast that it slammed backward into the glass wall behind her. She started screaming, a shrill, hysterical sound that echoed painfully in the confined space of the boardroom. She waved her hands frantically, pointing at the screen and shouting that it was a lie, a forgery, a pathetic trick I had cooked up to ruin her reputation. She looked at Harrison, the corporate attorney, begging him to tell me that the document was fake. But Harrison just sat there, his expression cold and professional, silently validating every single word I had just said. Valerie was sitting rigidly in her chair, her eyes darting between the massive projection screen and her screaming mother. The sheer horror dawning on her face was almost too painful to watch. Her brilliant, medically trained mind was rapidly calculating the timeline. 42 years ago, 2 years before her parents supposedly met. She was watching the foundational truth of her entire existence crumble into dust. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She just stared at Patty as if she were looking at a complete stranger, a monster wearing her mother's skin. On the other side of the table, Tommy was descending into a state of frantic, animalistic panic. He realized that the legal shield protecting their massive financial theft had just been completely obliterated. He scrambled out of my chair, his expensive shoes slipping awkwardly on the polished hardwood floor. He lunged toward the media console built into the center of the table, desperately searching for the remote control to turn off the projector. He wanted to hide the truth, as if turning off the light would somehow erase the monumental crime they had committed. He frantically mashed the buttons on the console panel, his hands shaking violently, muttering curses under his breath. I did not try to stop him. I did not need to physically fight my cowardly brother. I simply stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, my custom Italian suit, a dark armor against their pathetic chaos. I reached down to the keyboard of my silver laptop resting in front of me. I looked directly at Valerie, bracing myself for the final, most devastating blow of the demolition. I told her I was so incredibly sorry for what she was about to see. Then I pressed the spacebar. The image on the massive projection screen instantly shifted. The faded typewritten Nevada marriage certificate vanished, replaced by a crisp, modern medical document. The logo of a highly secure private diagnostic laboratory sat at the top of the page. Below it were columns of complex genetic markers, alleles, and DNA sequencing data. I watched Valerie's eyes track the information. As a pediatric surgeon, she did not need me to explain the medical terminology. She knew exactly what she was looking at the moment the document appeared. She read the final conclusion highlighted in bold black ink at the bottom of the page. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. I addressed Valerie gently but firmly, my voice softening, just a fraction, carrying the immense sorrow of a man who had lost his only child. I am not your biological father, Valerie. I looked across the table and pointed a steady finger directly at Tommy, who had frozen mid-panic beside the media console. The man sitting in my chair is... Valerie collapsed back into her seat, as if the bones in her legs had suddenly turned to liquid. She let out a sound that I will never forget for the rest of my life. It was a hollow, breathless gasp of pure agony. She brought both of her trembling hands up to cover her mouth, tears instantly spilling over her eyelashes and streaming down her face. She began to weep deep, shuddering sobs that shook her entire body. The illusion of her life was completely shattered. The loving father who had carried her on his shoulders, paid for her medical school, and loved her unconditionally, was not her blood. And the mother she had trusted implicitly had orchestrated this sickening, twisted joke, forcing her to live a lie every single day of her 35 years on this earth. The shock rapidly mutated into a fierce, blinding rage. Valerie dropped her hands from her face and stood up. She turned on Patty with a ferocity I had never seen in her before. She started screaming, her voice cracking with betrayal and disgust. She demanded to know how her own mother could be so profoundly evil. She asked how Patty could look me in the eyes for 4 decades, letting me sacrifice my health and my youth for a child that belonged to my parasitic brother. Patty reached out, tears streaming down her ruined makeup, begging Valerie to listen to her, pleading that she had done it all to keep the family together. But Valerie recoiled violently, slapping her mother's hand away as if it were coated in acid. She screamed at Patty not to ever touch her again. Then Valerie turned her fury onto Tommy. She looked at her biological father with absolute, unadulterated revulsion. She called him a coward, a parasite, a pathetic excuse for a human being who was too weak to raise his own daughter and too greedy to leave his brother in peace. She told him that she would rather die than share a single drop of his toxic blood. The family unit was completely and utterly disintegrating right in front of my eyes. The walls had fallen, the foundation was shattered, and nothing but toxic wreckage remained. I stood quietly at the head of the table watching the demolition conclude. I felt a strange, hollow peace. The truth was finally out in the open, raw and bleeding on the boardroom floor. Tommy stood by the console, absorbing his daughter's hatred. He looked at Valerie's disgusted face, then looked at Patty, who was sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. The emotional defeat was absolute. He had lost the love of his secret child, and his massive deception had been exposed to the harsh light of day. But Tommy had never been a man who cared about love, honor, or family. He only cared about one thing: survival. And to Tommy, survival meant money. I watched as his posture slowly changed. The frantic panic drained out of his body, replaced by a cold, hard desperation. He straightened his flashy suit jacket and ran a shaking hand through his gray hair. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to regain his composure. He turned away from his weeping daughter and locked his eyes on me. The arrogant, greedy sneer slowly crept back onto his face, twisting his features into an ugly mask of defiance. He walked back to my executive chair and gripped the leather backrest. He decided that if he had lost the moral high ground, he would simply retreat to the financial fortress he thought he had built. Fine, Tommy spat, his voice echoing loudly in the glass room, trying to project a power he no longer possessed. Fine. We are married. She is my kid. So what? You want to expose our secrets? You want to play the big, tough engineer? Go ahead. It does not matter anymore. He pointed a finger at the center of the mahogany table, directly at the spot where the legal documents had rested just a few minutes prior. You already signed the power of attorney yesterday, Richard. You gave us the keys to the kingdom. We already initiated the final transfers this morning. We already wired the entire $15 million offshore to the Cayman Islands. Tommy let out a sharp, breathless laugh, his eyes wide and manic with the thrill of his supposed victory. He leaned across the table, his face practically glowing with malicious triumph. You can humiliate us all you want, but you cannot touch that money. It is gone. And so is your company. You are broke, Richard. You have absolutely nothing left. I looked at Tommy standing there, puffing out his chest and desperately clinging to the illusion of his financial victory. He actually believed he had won. He actually thought that stealing my money was the final nail in my coffin. I did not yell. I did not scream. Instead, I let a smile slowly spread across my face. It was not a warm smile. It was a cold, terrifying expression that made Tommy instantly falter. The manic light in his eyes dimmed, as he realized I was not reacting like a man who had just lost everything. I looked at Harrison. The corporate attorney did not need a verbal command. He simply reached down, opened his heavy leather briefcase, and pulled out 2 thick manila folders. He walked around the massive mahogany table, his footsteps echoing in the absolute silence of the boardroom. He placed one folder directly in front of Patty, and he slid the second folder across the polished wood until it stopped right in front of Tommy. Neither of them moved to open the documents. They just stared at the thick brown paper as if it were a live explosive device. I stepped entirely away from the large media console and slowly walked straight back to my leather executive chair, leaning casually against the high leather backrest. "Go ahead and open them," I offered, my voice echoing with absolute authority. "But I can easily save you the immense trouble of reading through all the dense, complicated legal jargon. You see, Tommy, you made a catastrophic assumption. You falsely assumed that because Patty was my wife, she had the legal authorization to initiate a domestic transfer of my retirement funds. In a normal marriage, under Colorado community property laws, a spouse has certain implied privileges regarding shared assets. But as we just established with the Nevada marriage certificate, Patty was never my legal wife. Therefore, she had absolutely no authorization, implied or otherwise, to touch my private accounts or my corporate holdings. She was legally classified as a complete outsider, an unauthorized third party infiltrating a secure corporate network. When she cowardly plugged that little flash drive into my personal computer and secretly copied the master routing numbers, she committed a severe act of corporate espionage. But unfortunately, it gets so much worse for you." Tommy swallowed hard, his hands trembling, as he finally reached out and flipped open the heavy folder. His eyes darted frantically across the complex legal text, searching for a loophole, searching for anything that would make sense of the terror he was feeling. Patty did not even look at her folder. She just kept her eyes fixed on me, her face pale and shining with cold sweat. I continued my explanation, my tone steady and conversational, as if I were simply explaining a structural blueprint to an apprentice. When Victor, my private investigator, first detected the unauthorized transfers, I had a choice. I could have immediately called the bank, frozen the accounts, and dragged you both into a messy, prolonged civil lawsuit. But I knew that you would fight me every step of the way. You would hire defense attorneys, claim marital privilege, and tie up my assets for a decade in a grueling court battle. I did not want a legal battle. I wanted a demolition. So Harrison and I sat down and executed a retroactive corporate maneuver. We reclassified the entire $15 million fund. Valerie was watching me now, her tears slowing down as the sheer magnitude of my trap began to unfold. She was witnessing the true power of the man she had called her father for 35 years. I pointed at the legal documents resting under Tommy, shaking hands. "We changed the financial classification of that money," I stated clearly. "We transferred the total ownership of the fund to a third-party entity. You did not steal my personal retirement savings, Tommy. By utilizing your social security number and your digital signature to receive those funds in the Cayman Islands, you legally accepted the terms of a massive corporate transfer. You signed a binding corporate debt agreement. The $15 million you wired offshore is now officially classified as a high-risk unsecured financial loan. And the entity holding that loan is not my engineering firm. It is a company called Vanguard Debt Collection." Tommy gasped loudly, his weak chest heaving desperately, as if all the available oxygen had been suddenly and completely drained from the massive room. Patty let out a sharp, pathetic whimper of pure terror. In the corporate world, Vanguard was a name that inspired absolute dread. They were a ruthless venture capital firm known for hunting down bankrupt contractors and liquidating their lives. They did not negotiate settlements or listen to sob stories. They were a financial guillotine designed to sever the assets of anyone owing them money. Now, thanks to their own greed, Tommy and Patty were firmly locked into the guillotine. I walked slowly around the massive table until I was standing directly next to my treacherous brother. I looked silently down at his pathetic, trembling form. The arrogance had vanished, replaced by a suffocating despair. He knew exactly what Vanguard was capable of, and he had no way to fight them. I rested both of my hands on the mahogany table and leaned in close, bringing my face just inches away from his sweating forehead. The trap had snapped shut, crushing their spirits. I wanted him to feel the weight of the concrete collapsing on his chest. Because Patty was never my legal wife, she had no authorization to touch my private accounts. The $15 million you transferred, Harrison and I reclassified it. You did not steal my retirement, Tommy. You signed a binding corporate debt agreement with Vanguard Debt Collection. You now owe a predatory hedge fund $15 million at 22% interest, and you used federal wire channels to do it using a stolen identity. The absolute silence in the boardroom was no longer just heavy. It was completely suffocating. Tommy stared at me, his mouth hanging open, his chest heaving as the catastrophic reality of his situation finally crushed him. The arrogant sneer he had worn just moments ago was entirely erased, replaced by the hollow, wide-eyed stare of a man watching his own execution. He looked down at the thick legal folder resting on the mahogany table. He did not need to read the fine print to know that I was telling the absolute truth. The $15 million he thought he had successfully stolen was now a massive, inescapable chain wrapped tightly around his neck. Vanguard Debt Collection would not just freeze the Cayman Islands account. They would completely dismantle his life. They would seize his vehicles, garnish any future income, and relentlessly pursue him until the day he died. He was completely trapped, caught in a financial snare that he had eagerly locked himself into, and the realization of his monumental failure broke him instantly. A sudden, frantic surge of adrenaline flooded his system. Tommy staggered backward, knocking my heavy leather executive chair over with a loud crash. He did not try to negotiate. He did not try to offer an apology or beg for a compromise. His primal instinct took over completely. He turned away from the table, away from his weeping daughter and his terrified fake wife, and he ran. He bolted toward the heavy glass double doors of the boardroom, his expensive leather shoes sliding wildly on the polished hardwood floor. He slammed his hands against the thick glass, pushing with all his remaining strength, but the doors did not budge. He rattled the heavy metal handles, his breath fogging up the glass pane. He looked like a trapped animal in a transparent cage. He pounded his fists against the locked doors, shouting for someone in the outer lobby to let him out. But the employees in the outer corridor had already been cleared away. The executive floor was completely deserted, leaving Tommy to bang helplessly against the impenetrable barrier. I stood perfectly still at the head of the table, watching him completely humiliate himself. I let him struggle for a few agonizing moments. I wanted him to feel the absolute desperation of being locked in a room with the consequences of his own actions. Then I turned my head slightly and gave a single subtle nod to Harrison. The corporate attorney stood up from his seat, calmly straightening his suit jacket. He walked slowly across the boardroom, completely ignoring Patty, who was trembling violently in her chair. Harrison reached out and pressed the electronic release mechanism mounted on the wall next to the frame. A sharp, loud click echoed through the room as the heavy locking bolts retracted. Tommy practically threw his entire body weight against the glass. The double doors swung outward violently, and Tommy stumbled into the executive lobby, gasping for air and looking desperately for the nearest exit stairwell. But his frantic escape was brought to an immediate, brutal halt. Standing perfectly still in the center of the plush corporate lobby were three imposing figures. They were not building security guards. They wore dark, sharply tailored suits, and their expressions were carved from absolute stone. They were federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically assigned to the Division of White-Collar Crime, Federal Wire Fraud, and International Money Laundering. Harrison had coordinated their arrival perfectly. When we submitted the Vanguard debt documents the night before, the predatory financial firm had immediately flagged the unauthorized offshore wire transfer with the federal authorities. Because the $15 million crossed international borders, the crime fell strictly under federal jurisdiction. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with cold eyes, stepped forward and blocked Tommy from taking another step. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to display his gold badge. He stated his name and agency, clearly his voice carrying the absolute uncompromising weight of the United States government. He looked directly at my brother and asked him to confirm his identity as Thomas William Stanton. Tommy could not even speak. He just stood there swaying slightly on his feet, his face entirely drained of blood. Inside the boardroom, the reality of the federal agents finally snapped Patty out of her paralyzed state of shock. She realized that the financial ruin was only the beginning of their punishment. The federal prison system was waiting for them. She scrambled out of her chair, her knees completely giving out, before she could even take a full step. She hit the polished hardwood floor hard, crawling toward me on her hands and knees. Her designer blazer was rumpled, her perfect hair was a tangled mess, and her face was streaked with dark smeared makeup. She grabbed the fabric of my custom Italian trousers, burying her face against my legs. She started sobbing uncontrollably, begging me for mercy. She called me honey. She called me her sweet husband. She pleaded with me to remember the 40 years we had spent together, begging me to call off the agents, promising that she would do anything I wanted if I just gave her one more chance. I looked down at the woman who had spent 4 decades lying to my face. Hearing her call me honey, while federal agents stood just a few feet away, was the most pathetic, sickening thing I had ever experienced. There was absolutely no love left in my heart for her. There was not even anger anymore. There was only a cold, hollow disgust. I did not bend down to comfort her. I did not offer her a single word of forgiveness. I simply reached down, firmly grasped her wrists, and peeled her grasping fingers off my trousers. I stepped back, and then I stepped completely over her weeping body, as if she were nothing more than a discarded piece of trash on the floor. I walked toward the open boardroom doors, leaving her sobbing violently against the mahogany table. Out in the lobby, the lead federal agent was reciting the charges. He informed Tommy that he was being placed under immediate arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud, grand larceny, and the unauthorized transfer of corporate assets across international borders. As the agent reached to his heavy leather belt and pulled out a pair of cold steel handcuffs, Tommy began to hyperventilate. This time it was not a theatrical performance designed to manipulate my sympathy. This was a completely genuine, absolutely terrifying panic attack. His breathing became ragged and shallow. He clutched his chest with both hands, his eyes rolling back slightly as a massive wave of sheer terror overwhelmed his nervous system. His knees buckled and he collapsed heavily onto the carpeted floor of the lobby. The federal agents did not show a single ounce of pity. They had seen every trick in the book from wealthy criminals trying to avoid the cuffs. The 2 supporting agents immediately stepped forward, grabbed Tommy by the arms, and hauled him back to his feet. They roughly twisted his arms behind his back, and the sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the lobby was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Another agent walked past me into the boardroom. He approached Patty, who was still weeping on the floor, and ordered her to stand up. When she refused to move, paralyzed by her own despair, the agent simply hauled her to her feet and clamped a second pair of handcuffs around her wrists. He read her rights as he marched her out of the room. They were not given the dignity of leaving through a private back exit. The agents dragged Tommy and Patty straight toward the main glass elevators. As the doors opened, the entire corporate staff emerged from their offices. Dozens of my loyal employees, the engineers, the architects, and the administrative assistants all stood in the main hallway watching. They watched in absolute silence as the arrogant brother and the fake, deceitful wife were paraded through the building like common criminals. The humiliation was total, public, and completely inescapable. They were shoved into the elevator, the heavy metal doors closing firmly on their ruined lives. I slowly turned around and walked back into the completely quiet boardroom. Valerie was still sitting alone at the large mahogany table. She had buried her face deep in her hands, crying softly, as the entire reality of her broken family completely dissolved into nothing. I stood there for a moment. I looked at her with profound sadness, but the structural demolition was finally over and entirely complete. The foundation was gone. I calmly walked over to my chair, grabbed my leather briefcase, and methodically packed away my documents and personal files, ready to leave this toxic nightmare behind me forever and start completely fresh. It has been exactly 6 weeks since the heavy glass doors of that executive elevator closed on my past. I sold the massive suburban mansion to a commercial real estate developer for a straight cash offer. I did not care about negotiating the absolute highest price. I just wanted that physical structure completely out of my name. The memories trapped inside those walls were tainted, and I refused to spend another night sleeping under a roof built on deceit. Instead, I bought a modern, beautifully minimalist penthouse high above downtown Denver. Right now, I am standing on my private glass balcony feeling the crisp, clean Colorado wind against my face, looking out at the majestic snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains. The air up here is thin and cold, but for the very first time in 40 years, I can finally breathe deeply. The suffocating weight of my previous life is entirely gone. The dust from the demolition has finally settled, and the federal justice system moved with a terrifying, efficient speed. Because Vanguard Debt Collection handed the federal agents a perfectly wrapped package of irrefutable financial evidence, my brother Tommy was immediately denied bail. The federal judge took one look at the offshore Cayman Islands routing numbers and deemed him a significant, undeniable flight risk. Tommy is currently sitting in a maximum security federal detention center, wearing a cheap orange jumpsuit instead of his flashy custom suits. He is facing a mandatory minimum of 20 years for international wire fraud, grand larceny, and money laundering. At his age, 20 years is a definitive life sentence. He will never walk free again. Furthermore, Vanguard executed their corporate debt clauses with absolute ruthlessness. They seized every single asset he had left to cover the massive interest penalties. Patty was left with absolutely nothing. Because her marriage to me was a legally verified fraud, she walked away from my empire without a single penny to her name. She attempted to hire a desperate lawyer to claim spousal alimony, but the judge threw her case out of court and threatened her with federal perjury charges. The woman who used to sip vintage champagne and wear silver designer evening gowns is currently living in a cheap, rundown motel on the far industrial outskirts of the city. To pay for her weekly rent and basic groceries, she is working double shifts, washing greasy dishes and wiping down tables at a roadside diner. She tried calling Valerie hundreds of times, leaving pathetic, weeping voicemails, begging for money and begging for forgiveness. But every single one of those desperate calls went entirely unanswered. Valerie completely cut her out of her life. Speaking of Valerie, she came to visit me at the penthouse just a few days ago. When I opened the heavy oak door, my heart ached for her. She looked incredibly fragile. The devastating truth had aged her, but it had also hardened her resolve. She walked into my bright living room, sat down on my leather sofa, and simply broke down. She apologized over and over again for the sickening lies her mother and uncle had spun. She told me she felt completely lost, that her entire identity had been erased, and that she did not know who she was anymore. I sat down right next to her and put my arm around her shaking shoulders, just like I did when she was a little girl skinning her knees on the concrete sidewalk. I looked into her tear-filled eyes and told her the absolute truth. I said, Valerie D. Sam makes biology, but love makes a father. You will always be my daughter. I am the man who held you when you were sick in the middle of the night. I am the man who cheered the loudest for you at your medical school graduation. A piece of paper from a laboratory can never erase the pure love I poured into your soul. But I need you to deeply understand that I am no longer part of that family. My boundaries are permanently set. Valerie nodded, resting her head against my chest, and hugged me tightly. In that quiet, beautiful moment, our relationship was rebuilt on a solid foundation of absolute honesty. After she left the penthouse, I walked over to my crystal decanter and poured myself a neat glass of aged bourbon. I walked back out to the balcony and held the amber liquid up to the fading sunlight, watching it glow. As a master structural engineer, I spent my entire career designing massive buildings that could withstand the harshest natural elements. I learned a long time ago that when you discover a deeply flawed, rotten foundation, you cannot just patch the superficial cracks and hope for the best. You have to tear the whole thing down to the dirt. The collapse of a rotten building is never a tragedy. It is a necessary clearing of the ground. It is a beautiful, profound opportunity to build something vastly stronger in its place. I did not just save my personal wealth during this ordeal. I saved my soul. And sitting in the quiet luxury of my new home, I decided that I did not need millions of dollars sitting dormant in a corporate account to make me happy. Yesterday morning, I officially established a $10 million educational foundation. It is a fully funded scholarship program designed specifically to pay the university tuition for young, underprivileged students who possess a burning desire to study structural engineering and architecture. I am taking the money I bled for the money my treacherous family tried to steal, and I am using it to build the bright futures of kids who actually deserve a chance. I took a slow sip of my bourbon, feeling the rich warmth spread through my chest. I am 70 years old. Most people in this society think 70 is the end of the road, a time to quietly fade away into the background. But as I look out over the beautiful, glowing Denver skyline, I realize I have finally shed the parasitic weight I blindly carried for 4 agonizing decades. I am completely free, my mind is incredibly sharp, and my life has just begun. The greatest lesson I learned from this agonizing journey is that loyalty should never be blind. We often allow the title of family to excuse toxic, manipulative, and deeply selfish behavior. We willingly sacrifice our own physical well-being, our financial security, and our mental peace to protect people who would not hesitate to completely destroy us for their own personal gain. True family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, unwavering honesty, and genuine care, not just shared genetics or a legal marriage certificate. You must never be afraid to enforce your personal boundaries and boldly walk away from a toxic environment. Your human dignity and your emotional peace are always worth protecting, no matter how much it temporarily hurts to let go. If my journey resonated with your heart today, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss my next life story. Share this video with someone who might desperately need the courage to stand up for themselves against a toxic family, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I look forward to reading them. See you in the next video.